Okay, so there was a feedback loop there. Okay, so now we have a me and we have a you.
And I can see the chat. Perfect.
Hallelujah. I don't do this very often. Well, the echo should be muted now. So okay, so we have me and we have Pete. So okay, if you see Pete's mouth moving and you don't hear anything, let me know. Okay, so for the 105 of you who are here, it's I'm sure it's 110 now. There we go. All right, so Pete is a Canadian with a very Russian-sounding name. So I presume that the reason that you have been able to run the Tank Archive site with such a focus on Russia is that you can actually speak Russian.
Yes, I can. That's correct. I
Ah.
was born in Moscow and moved to Toronto, Canada, sometime later, so I can speak fluently English and Russian, and not so fluently French and English.
Yeah. So your Tank Archive site, yeah, that's been going a few years now, and it is one of the better English language resources for Russian information. What do you use for your sources? Do you do any or did you do any archive digging, or are you looking at Russian authors? So how do you find your stuff?
So I started out with documents that were uploaded by primarily Yuri Pashalok and other World of Tanks and Wargaming employees. And for the first 2 years, that was really my bread and butter, is just the translation of those documents. And then I started venturing out into the archives myself. So both Russian ones and the Russian government doesn't do a lot of good things, but the few good things it does is upload archive documents online for easy searchable access. So there's the links in my sidebar where you can see all these documents that I go and get. Um, Mostly World War II era, but there's some other eras coming out. And there's also a joint project between the Russian and German governments to upload documents from what's called Fund 500. These are captured German documents. And of course, it's all online for free. That project is still going. Fingers crossed they don't shut it down. But that's very useful to researchers everywhere. In the last couple of years, since starting in 2017, I believe, I started writing for Warspot, was Wargaming's military history kind of portal, using Canadian documents. So the Library and Archives Canada has a pretty huge database. Unfortunately, it's not indexed almost at all and not searchable at all, but it's there. There's a ton of documents that were scanned first to microfiche and then online. And that's also, especially for, when I'm writing about Western vehicles, Canadian, American, British, I rely on that. But a lot of it, of course, also does come from secondary sources. So I have quite a lot of books, which you can see at the bottom of my recordings on my YouTube channel. This is behind me right now is all DVDs. But yeah, I started my career with primary sources, and that's still very much the basis of my work.
Is that Santa in a Mark IV over your left shoulder?
Sorry?
I'm looking over your left shoulder at the shelf. It looks like Santa Claus sticking his head out of a Mark IV.
Oh, that's Winston Churchill. It's a teapot.
Oh, okay.
I have a matching. I don't know how well you can see it in the stream, but there's some Mark V in there as well.
All right. Okay, so rules for chat. Go ahead, put if you have any particular questions as we start talking. Just put them in the chat, and assuming that they're not impolite or anything, we'll see about addressing them. Okay, so the reason that so we're bringing you in is it's over your left shoulder as well, strategically placed, where we can accidentally see it. Is your new book in your eyes too? That's not your first book. So I have at least two others of yours. One is a more technical history of the T-34, and one is more of an operational level history of the Russian or the Soviet Shermans. So is this book number 3 then, or have I missed one?
This is book number 3. Yes,
Was T-34M real and could it have entered service? They never actually built one, did they?
they started. They built So the pictures that you see right now, if you type in T-34M into Google, are a wooden model that they built. There's blueprints of the real thing that they would have built. It looks different from that. They started building armor components and testing them, and then something happened on June 22nd, 1941, and then new tank projects were kind of shut down across the board. So depends on how you define real. They could have built it by the end of the year. If they had built it, it would have entered production to replace the T-34. As it stands, certain aspects of the design were incorporated into production T-34s. So I don't have any models on hand right now to show you, but it could be something for a video.
So your first book, was that the T-34 book or the Sherman one?
T-34 was my first book, yep.
So what was the, I mean, there are so many books on T-34. What was your philosophy behind writing that one?
They're all bad.
What was the distinguishing feature, shall we say, that said, okay, look, I need to write something?
There are a lot of books on the T-34, you're correct. Not a lot of them focus on the actual design. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, a lot of them say, June 22nd, 1941, whatever it was, 8 or 9 a.m., clashes at the border. Here's this weird new tank came from nowhere. So they're written from this very much, a German perspective, which makes sense because a lot of these books are still based on information that came from memoirs of German generals, where you have Guderian who says, oh man, when we started losing, this T-34 tank showed up, and I'll blame all my problems on it. Which is not entirely correct. And so there's a lot of documents, specifically on the development of T-34 uploaded by Makarov, who was director of the T-34 Museum, which is dedicated entirely to the tank. And
where is that?
It's quite close to Moscow. I personally have never actually been, but we are in contact through Facebook. Through social media. And again, social media has just been a blessing for historians everywhere, or you can actually get in touch with these people across the world and share information and share documents. And so this guy's been uploading these documents for years and years now, and I was looking at them and I could just carve out it, like just even with just these documents, even just this information, take it, put it together, and put a book out. And then I did. And it seems to have been quite well received.
Okay, so your second book on the Sherman, that's not. I was kind of hoping to find some technical evaluations or so on. It's more of an operational history of how and where it was used. Less than. Everybody's question is, did the Russians like the Sherman? Now, I'm guessing that was simply due to a lack of source.
They did like the Sherman. So with the Sherman book. The Sherman book was quite different because with the T-34, the scope was very well defined. It was designing the T-34. I consider, that was what I set out to do. I achieved it in 100-odd pages. I was pretty satisfied with that. With the Sherman, it's considerably longer. I think when I crossed 100 pages and I wasn't anywhere close to finishing it, I thought, well, I might be a little bit out of my depth here. And with the deadline approaching very quickly, some sacrifices that had to be made. But I think I did a good job of choosing representative engagements. There's one from every era of the war. The one that I wish I had included is an article that I had written after the book came out as a sort of promotional material. It tackled two myths that weren't really addressed in the book. One is that, the Soviets liked the Sherman so much that it was this elite tank. It was only given to guards regiments, the best of the best. Everyone else, illiterate peasants, they were on T-34s. And the other one is that the exact opposite is lend-lease tanks were considered garbage. They were given, to just rejects. You never got any medals. You never got any orders. You were basically ignored and written out of history if you drove a lend-lease tank. And of course, both of these can't be true, but in this article, I talk about how neither are true, and within the same brigade, you had these tanks bounce around. Sorry, within the same corps, you had the tanks bounce around between guards and non-guards brigades. And later on in the same campaign, this was around the Baltics. They keep changing the name of these cities. The assault on Memel in 1944. You had a Sherman tank and a T-34 tank take out a Tiger. And the commanders of both tanks got nominated for the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. So, same achievement, same award. There wasn't really any kind of stigma associated with these tanks. And again, these weren't really elite tanks that were only assigned to the best of the best. They were just tanks. The only direct comparison between Sherman and T-34 I've seen in documents says the T-34 was better. But then again, the same comparison says the KV is better, and I disagree. So I'm sure there's personal feelings associated with these evaluations, but in my personal opinion, T-34 and Sherman, and then later on the T-34-85 and the 76mm Shermans, they can do the job that they're given as medium tanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's always the case of perspective. I mean, I've always put it that Sherman was a better tank for the Americans. I would assume that if you're a Russian and you have your own criteria for what works in the Red Army, you could come with a different conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So
and that's
yeah, go on.
The Canadians among you will recognize my magic ring. I didn't go to I'm not a historian by training. I went to engineering school, and that's one of the things that they teach you is a good solution is the one that meets requirements. And people say German tanks are over-engineered. I would say they were engineered badly. You can't do too much engineering. You can't do too little engineering. You can do the correct amount of engineering or the wrong amount of engineering. And so in this case, yes, the Sherman and the T-34 satisfied the requirements that their respective armies assigned to them.
So Todd has a question. Is the whole T-34 crews were only expected to survive for 2 weeks a true statement? I mean, I guess what he's talking about is, was there a deliberate design philosophy that these things were disposable, that they didn't care about the crew survivability or the vehicle survivability, or is that just a myth that we invented in the West?
So I have an article about that on my blog. That is something you hear a lot, and the number that these tanks are supposed to survive for is always different. I see 2 weeks, I see 2 hours in battle, I see 8 hours. I think somebody rolls the dice whenever they type this up. I have never seen any kind of estimate about how long somebody's supposed to last in battle. And if you actually look at the operation history of the T-34, there's always this aim to make it last longer, make the tank drive longer. Before the war, the requirement that Stavko, the high command, wanted for their T-34 tanks was drive 10,000 kilometers. That, for anybody who's only vaguely aware of World War II tanks, that's an incredible and impossible distance.
Yeah, even Shermans weren't really supposed to go that long without serious overhaul.
Right, yeah. It was unachievable for the T-34. The A-34s, the initial trials were 3,000 kilometers, and the tanks at the end, they needed new tracks, they needed new engines. So yeah, it was an impossible dream, but it was an impossible dream that Soviet High Command still dreamed. So there was no kind of expectation of pop some conscripts in a tank, they'll drive around for a couple of hours and blow up, and that's good enough.
Okay, here's a question I hadn't seen from Mr. Stockdale, or not Mr. Stockdale. Did Soviet tank units tend to have a different proportion of ethnic Russians compared to infantry, artillery, or anything else? Or was it simply a case of, if you're from, I don't know, maybe from Eastern Russia, you're shorter, so you're more likely to be in a tank?
I can't say I've ever encountered such granular demographics. there's a stickied thread on my Twitter account, and there's a couple of answers on Ask Historians on Reddit that I gave about just the general ethnic composition of the Red Army. Just kind of based on the names that I remember from reading documents, I don't think there was a disproportional amount of any kind of ethnicity or any conscious attempt to choose, certain people. There might have been a kind of implicit bias, since things like tanks, like artillery, they require technical aptitude of some kind. And if you were from European USSR, odds are you went to, university, you were more educated, you were more literate, you've handled tractors or some kind of mechanized agriculture before. So, maybe that made you more likely to get into tanks. But then again, I read these complaints from early 1941 when the Red Army was expanding its mechanized corps. Officers are saying, we're getting these guys who are lieutenants, junior lieutenants sent. They've never seen a tank before. They're being assigned, to tank regiments. They don't know, they don't know anything, the first thing about tanks. So I would very cautiously say that there wasn't any kind of bias either way.
Inceptor, when we start talking about the guns on the IS-2, if we don't mention it, go ahead, copy-paste that one, we'll get back to it. What problems did T-34 present Soviet industry?
One of the biggest problems was armor. So the T-28 was the USSR's medium tank. I'm going to put a big asterisk next to medium. But it was the USSR's previous medium tank. They built a couple of hundred of them.
Well, I mean, compared to the T-35, which came around at more or less the same time.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm going to get to that. But here's this wonderful thing, and I've taken the side skirts off so you can see how easy and simple the suspension is. And count the turrets. Sorry. No, this is ICM. I built this a very, very long time ago, and if you wanted a T-35, ICM was the best you could do. And it's okay. It's better than Airfix. But yeah, and then the T-34, they were going to build them by the thousand, and so the question was, how do you roll so much armor for them? And armor is a quite expensive thing to do. Steel, regular steel, you get some iron, throw some carbon in it, it's fine. Armor steel, it needs nickel, it needs molybdenum, and one of the most difficult things to do was to develop armor that could be made not from pure nickel, but from secondary, so side byproducts of other industrial processes. You get this heap of minerals, and there's nickel in it. It's perfectly fine, and you need to make armor out of that rather than the pure and clean stuff that you probably even have to import at this point. And they did it, quite well. And again, on my blog, I have these tests of this armor that came through this process. Throughout the war, they had to change the composition and process several times. There was even proposal to use American steel.
I was about to ask, the US did send a lot of steel over, so was that used for something other than armor?
It wasn't used for armor. It was just used for structural steel. I think there's a carved out exception to use it for T-70s, but they didn't like American steel.
Are you planning on doing a second book on T-34, maybe focusing on the 85 or other variants?
I am in the process of writing my second book on the T-34. I don't know how much I can talk about that, but it's not a design book. It's going to be more combat focused. I highly doubt it's going to be my last. It's not going to be about the T-34-85, but I very much want to get to the T-34-85 eventually.
Gotcha. Hello, Sweden. Greetings. Good evening to you. There were tank divisions in the Far East and Transbaikal districts in early 1945. Why weren't they reorganized to tank corps? I have no idea.
The Far East was kind of frozen in time. Because obviously all of the attention was paid to the European theater, and the Far East. It's a question I answered on Reddit a while back. People do ask this once every so often, like what kind of tanks they had, and they still had T-27s, the tiny tankette, two-man with a machine gun. They had T-37s, amphibious tanks. They had T-38s. They had BTs. And they had this zoo of horrible, obsolete things that were pushing a decade of service by this point.
I mean, was there any real
They
expectation that they would have trouble from China or Japan? Or, I mean,
China,
how much
no.
thought did they put towards it?
Japan, yeah. So these guys were kind of on their own, but they were very much kept in combat readiness. So the BT-7s got extra armor welded onto them. And I have a couple of documents around that. The strangest thing is they somehow got their hands on old Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. And so the documents say this is captured German armor. They welded on top of their BT-7s. The T-38s were rearmed with 20 millimeter guns instead of their machine guns. Extra armor welded on. They lost their ability to float because they were so heavy at this point. But they were keeping these tanks kind of more or less competitive, and so there was definitely some kind. It was either keeping people's hands busy so they don't, do whatever it is enlisted men do when they don't have anything to do. But there was definitely some kind of conscious preparation for a Japanese invasion.
So when the focus changed in the summer of '45, did those units partake in anything, or was it all stuff that was transferred in from the West?
The focus started to change in the winter of 1945. So there's an order that I have on my blog where they're upgrading something like one regiment per brigade, or one battalion, something per regiment, something like that, with T-34 tanks, and the rest of them are still old and worn out. And so I do cover this in my Sherman book. There was a small amount of T-26s and BT-7s. By small amount, I mean like 100 BT-7s and a couple dozen of T-26s that do set out in August into Manchuria. They do not make it very far. They do actually complain in the Transbaikal Front documents. They do complain that these tanks broke down. They're not written off. We do actually need to pull them away. All of our tractors, all of our prime movers are being wasted pulling around these horrible old tanks that we don't actually need. And HVSS Shermans, so the M4A2 76 WHVSS, the M3, the EZ8s that started coming into the summer, they were actually used as tractors because they had the nice white tracks. They do quite well in the mud, and so they were pulling the old narrow track Shermans out of mud. Because once you cross the Gobi Desert and get into the mountains, it does get quite wet.
Okay. I think last question before we go on to the IS-2s. When did Soviet radio, well, it says production, but we'll say provision, because you also had lend-lease and so on. Because there's always a reputation, you only had one radio per platoon or whatever. But obviously that wasn't the case for most of the war. So when did that change?
The answer is it depends. So, what I would call premium tanks, T-28s, T-35s, KVs, the kind of specialized vehicles, all of them had radios, every single one. T-60s, none of them had a radio. There was orders, there was provisions for them. They just didn't build them with radios. And then T-34s were built, 40% of them had radios, so platoon commander and up. Naturally, wartime pressures could be more, could be less. But as of 1943, there was an order that says you need to put a radio on everything. This actually included British radios. They were quite big fans of wireless number 19 radio sets. If you're lucky enough to see a Canadian Mark III, I believe I have in my collection a faceplate from it. all of the labels are in both Russian and English. Because the Canadians built so many of them for the export market, for to send to the USSR, that you might as well just, print this label in two languages. And they still use them with these Russian labels into the 70s or 80s, I believe. And that's why there's so many of these working radios still out there.
Okay, so let's move on to the IS-2 book. So this is not my first IS book, because I also have the one by Baryatinsky, for example, which have been fairly good. So what does your book do that this one doesn't?
So I do have that book in original Russian. I can't say I've read it all the way through. My book is more focused. It's focused on well, I say it's focused on IS-2 development. There's not really any side offshoots from ISU. I mentioned them briefly. The ISU, the IS-3. I do also get into why the IS-2 was built in the first place. So, T-35. There's a reason why I have the model out.
You do spend a lot more time talking about the KV-13 and vehicles of that era as well.
Yes.
So how do you get from KV-1 to IS via KV-13?
All right. Well, so I can. That's where the models come in. So I can kind of start showing you these two side by side.
Okay.
So this is a KV 1940 production, and this is a KV 1941 production.
You have to hold it up because my window's in the bottom left corner there. Other side. There you go.
There we go. All right. And you can kind of see the difference. The one here has a heavier gun. You can see the bolted-on armor. On the front there, it's a little bit more obvious. Not much else has changed about the tank. And it turns out that if you build a tank and then start bolting stuff to it, you can't do that indefinitely. So this guy over here weighs they were accepted into service with an official weight of 40 tons. I don't believe that a KV that weighed 40 tons was ever actually built. This guy over here, 48, 49 tons. Sorry?
You don't think anything was as heavy as 40 tons, or anything was as light as 40 tons?
They were all heavier. Okay. They were all heavier than that. And then this guy over here with all the extra armor and the larger gun, that was pushing 48, 49 tons. And then when you get into cast turrets and casting defects, when there's a problem with casting, the casting becomes thicker rather than thinner. So we had these tanks with over 100 millimeters of cast armor on them that weighed over 50 tons. And so this was kind of okay in the fall. And then when you get into driving into deep snow, the transmission says, oh, geez, goodbye. And the engine says, I'm out of here. And the KV engines, there were 600 horsepower instead of 500 on the T-34. And so the pressure they were working at was quite immense. And so you had these mass widespread failures of KV tanks. And this went up to Stalin personally. There's a phone call that he has with Malyshev, I believe, where he says, how come the T-34 is like a swallow that floats above the snow and the KV doesn't drive in the snow? And there was an inquiry, and people figured out, hey, you can't take a 50-ton tank and put it in a chassis of a 40-ton tank. This is a lesson the Germans will learn later as well. And there were some half measures to reduce the weight of the tank. They didn't effectively manage to do anything with it. And KV-1S came out. This was 42.5 tons was the weight of the KV-1S. The problem with the KV-1S is you sacrificed the KV-1's primary advantage, which was armor. The front armor was still 75 millimeters. The side armor was considerably thinner. The armament at this point is still the same as the T-34. And so the reasonable question is asked, what's the point? What's the point of this tank that's more expensive than a T-34, more complicated than a T-34, has more or less the same armor, same armament as a T-34?
It's kind of a similar
in parallel
to the T-50 Light then, no?
The T-50 is another interesting example. I can talk about the T50 separately, and maybe if there's time in the end, we can get back to the T50. But
Okay.
the T50, there was an argument we should produce the T50s instead of the T34 because it's almost as well armored. You could theoretically put a 76 millimeter gun in it. It had advantages over the T34. I'll give it that. But what it didn't have was a production base. There was nowhere to build engines. There was nowhere to build hulls. There was nowhere to assemble the thing. And just purely from a management perspective, the T34 has the incumbent advantage.
Okay. All right. Back to the KV-1S.
Right. So the KV-1S was not great. And around this time, you start having the Germans really propel their own armor design forward. So you have the Panzer IV as F2, and then later the G with the long 75 millimeter gun. The Stug 40, you have the Pak 40 come out in numbers, and so 75 millimeters of armor isn't really impressing anyone anymore. And so there's work begins on two new tanks. I say new. One of them is very similar to the T-34M. It's now called T-43, but very similar to what used to was kind of kicking around Factory 183. And then the other one is of course the KV-13. Is my video frozen or something?
Okay. You're back again. I'm not sure what happened.
Okay. Anyway, I'll rewind a little bit. Summer of 1942,
your audio
Germans.
was fine.
Oh, my audio is fine. Okay, perfect. Right. So anyway, so you have these two. People say they're competing tanks. They're not really competing tanks. Puzzlingly enough, they're made to the same set of requirements, but they're not competing tanks. Once the T-43 was always a medium, the KV-13 was always a heavy. And so the KV-13 has 120 millimeters of armor at a weight of 35 tons.
But if they have the same requirements, then surely the requirements are set by doctrine. So how do you have two different doctrines, one for heavy, one for medium, and you end up with the same requirements?
Interesting question. I haven't looked very deeply into it. But again, the two tanks started to diverge quite considerably. The T-43, it was around 30 tons, even though the limit was 35. And then the KV-13, again, 35 tons for a heavy tank is not a realistic weight limit. It started getting fatter. And I think the first one was 37.5 tons, which is still considerably less than the KV or KV-1S. It was still quite a feat to make a tank with 120 millimeters of armor in such a small and compact package. They eliminated the radio operator and hull gunner, and I can actually show you. Oops, turret came off. Show you here. The KV. Here's the KV-1. It's got the machine gun sticking out the front. This guy on this side. Is it in camera? I can see kind of here. This is the KV-85. KV-85 hull.
It's your right hand that's too low. Yeah, there you go.
The hull, you can see the little nub sticking out next to the headlight. That's the machine gun. It's just fixed forward. It gives the driver something to do to make him feel like he's contributing to the battle. And then the KV-13 already had that. And so the front of the hull was kind of already very similar to what would come out in the IS-2, so it's kind of curved. One of the reasons why they managed to keep the weight down was that it wasn't just plates of armor anymore. It was shaped around what was inside, going on inside the tank. And that seemed great. They built the KV-13. Tsates, the engineer behind it, was quite superstitious. So instead of the KV-13, he called it IS-1. IS, of course, stands for Joseph Stalin. It's definitely a job security feature to call your tank your boss's name, with the caveat that if the tank isn't very good, you might lose your job or more than that. And so they made this tank.
And which gun are they looking at this point?
This is still the 76. So the belief is that the Germans, their Panzer IV has 50 millimeters of front armor, vertical. The F-32, the F-34 can penetrate it at up to 1,800 meters, something like that. So you don't really need a bigger gun. And they're designing this new generation of heavy tanks and medium tanks with still the 76 millimeter gun and still the narrow turret ring. I mean, not for the KV, it wasn't that narrow. I believe it was like 1,700 millimeters, so less than the Sherman, but still enough for 3 people.
So were these heavy tanks? Was there a change in their proposed use with experience from the KV? I mean, were they still to be entirely separate regiments used independently, or were they to be used to backstop the medium tanks? Kind of like, let's say, Fireflies would be used to backstop regular Shermans.
So the KV regiments were actually a development of 1942. In 1941 units, the KVs were used in regular tank brigades. Everybody got, a dozen KV-1s, couple dozen T-34s, and then a whole bunch of T-60s. And then they would advance in these rows with KVs up front, and then T-34s behind them, and then T-60s mopping up whatever was left behind. And one of the biggest tactical developments of 1942 was the creation of independent Guards heavy tank breakthrough regiments. And they changed their name and purpose a little bit as the war went on, but they remained independent. So it was just KVs. You would put this regiment, it was subordinate directly to the army, and it was assigned to wherever you needed to do a breakthrough. Once the breakthrough is achieved, T-34s, at that point, regular tank brigades were medium and light tanks, so either T-34s and T-70s, or Shermans and Valentines, or if you were really unlucky, medium tank M3 and then light tank M3. But by 1943, there weren't that many of those left. And so, so the KVs, and then later the KV-1Ss, Churchills as well, and then the IS tanks, they were already all in their individual regiments. And so the KV-13 at this point there was not really a doctrinal shift. It was the same thing, but tougher, pretty much. 120 millimeters of front armor, same gun, because it was considered sufficient. The only change was that the KV-13 was called the IS-1. There was also the IS-2. It has very little to do with the IS-2 that we know and love, and that's on the cover of that book. But it was called IS-2, and it had a different turret with a 122 millimeter howitzer on it. Same one as the KV-9, but the turret's different, even though it looks the same. And then these tanks were tested in the spring of 1943. They were generally satisfactory. There were a couple of notes, a couple of improvements that were needed. I go over them in the book. And then something happened in April of 1943. It was it's not what you would call a significant emotional event, but it was significant, and I'm sure to some people it was emotional. 2 Tiger tanks were captured intact near Leningrad in January. January 16th, actually. So 80 years minus a day ago. And they put these tanks to trials, and it turns out that they have a bit of armor on them, specifically twice as much front armor as a Panzer IV, and 4 times as much side armor as a Panzer IV. And so the F-34 gun, owing in part to its low velocity and in part to quality of the ammunition, doesn't penetrate the front armor. It doesn't penetrate the upper side armor. I think they gave up at that point. They never tried it against the lower side, the 62 millimeter. I'm not sure why, but I think the conclusion was very clear. Hey, we need a bigger gun. And they tested a bunch of other guns, particularly the 85 millimeter AA gun, 52K. And okay, oh cool. It turns out it goes through the front of the tank, no problem, at a range of up to 1.5 kilometers. Okay, well, we need to put this gun on a tank. Good news is that there were a couple of other 85 millimeter gun developments, just to sort of, future-proof designs. The 85 millimeter gun is big, so no one really wanted to squeeze it into the tank unless it was necessary. Unfortunately, now it was necessary, so they quickly dusted off some old projects that they had, and then the S1 turret here. This is from my KV-85 kit. You have the nice big gun sticking out the end. Wider turret ring. They had to extend the tank, so the KV-13 had 5 road wheels on it. You'll notice that the IS series have 6. I think the hull needed to be wider, the hull needed to be longer, just to kind of, balance it out. And then you have the IS-1, and it's great. Okay, it goes through trials. You have an 85 millimeter gun on it. You can destroy any tank the Germans have. There's a little note in one of the decrees Stalin signs around that time to work on bigger guns. So 85 millimeter high velocity with 1,000 meters per second muzzle velocity, 100 millimeter guns and 122 millimeter guns. And then a couple of months later, the Panther comes out, and the 85 millimeter gun penetrates the lower front plate at 300 meters, and then the gun mantlet at, I forget the exact number, but also a couple of 100 meters, and the upper front plate not at all. This is a big problem. Good news is that development of a 122 millimeter tank gun is already underway.
So the 100 could or could not deal with the problem?
I haven't tested it at that point. I'll get to 100 millimeter guns at the end of this. There's a whole separate chapter on all this alternative armaments for the IS-2.
Okay.
But yeah, the 122 proved itself against the Tiger tank already, so development was already underway. There's actually a lot of these requirements for the IS-2, the new IS-2, Object 240. The previous IS-2 was called Object 4, and they dropped the top speed to something like 32 kilometers an hour because they were afraid that this gun was huge and heavy. And it would take a lot of space. They actually took out the radio from the IS-2 prototype to just really make sure the gun would fit, and the rear machine gun as well. And the gun fit. It was fine. None of these problems that they foresaw with mobility came to light, so there's comparative trials. The IS-1 and IS-2 drive around at roughly the same speed in the same conditions. The problem was, of course, reload rate, and I'll get to that later. But that was the IS-1 turned out to be very time limited. And I don't want to say by design, but it was kind of already, when it was accepted into service, by that time, this was already October, there was already orders. We need to replace it with something.
Okay, yeah.
Just to get a future proof. I see a question in the chat about German documents. It's called FOND, FONZ 500. If you Google German docs in Russia, I think it will. You'll see it. And it has both original German language documents and captured documents that were translated into Russian during the war. So very, very useful source. But back to the IS-2. The 122 millimeter gun is big. The shell for the 122 millimeter gun, the actual shell itself weighs 25 kilograms. And then the propellant casing, which loads separately, is another 15 kilograms. And then to add to that, the original Z25T gun had a screw breech. So, you have this big chunk. If you've never seen a screw breech in a museum, Google it. You have this kind of, if you'd visit a tank gun right now, you have a sliding breech goes up and down. Put a shell in front of it, load it in. Breech closes, nice and compact. A screw breech is this massive chunk of steel in front of you. You open it, it swings out towards you. Now you have this big chunk of steel right next to your chest, and you have to maneuver the shell around it. and it's this whole process. This was not entirely satisfactory, and there were multiple programs launched to kind of get around that. One of which was developing a semi-automatic breech for the D-25, which went into production in, I want to say, March of 44. It was fairly early on in the production process. But alternative guns were also considered, and so one of which was a 100 millimeter gun. The problem with 100 millimeter guns is that this was a naval caliber and not a land forces caliber. And so you would need to introduce a completely new caliber into your supply system, but also develop AP shells, because there weren't AP shells for the 100 millimeter caliber. There was naval semi AP, which I didn't really look into that deeply, but it wasn't satisfactory as an armor piercing round. And I think somebody in the chat alluded to this. There were trials held against Captured Panther, where some interesting data came out of that. The 122 millimeter gun, I think they write that the limit of penetration was to 2,000 meters. So at 2,000 meters, the shell no longer penetrates the Panther's front armor. This is another one of those statements you need to put an asterisk on, because the shell does in fact ricochet and fly off somewhere into the distance. Unfortunately for the Panther, there's a chunk of steel about this big that is now dislodged from the upper front plate that continues the shell's trajectory into the tank. So I'm sure if you told the tank's crew that, oh, the shell didn't actually penetrate, you're fine, they would beg to disagree. So this is where penetration mechanics, like in World of Tanks or in War Thunder, don't necessarily reflect what happens to a tank when it's hit by on a 122 millimeter shell. And then, of course,
I assume it didn't like getting hit by a 122 millimeter high explosive round either.
No, not really. There's trials that I have on my blog as well for blast injuries, where they would put both vibration sensors and small animals into tanks and then fire 122 millimeter HE at them to see what happens. They died. You will die. If you sit in a tank that's pounded by 122 millimeter HE, you will die in one way or another. So don't do it, kids. But yes, so Panther trials, 100 millimeter gun penetrates it at only 1,200 meters. So considerable difference in AP penetration. I've never seen trials for HE, but I'm sure 100 millimeter HE, smaller shell, it's not going to be as effective.
So, okay, slight detour then. When they made the SU-100 with the 100 millimeter gun, there was the ISU-122 with a short howitzer. Was there any attempt to put a 122 long barrel, a D-25, into the SUs? I mean, wouldn't that solve both problems?
That's called 122... 122P, I believe. And then they tried to put a D-25 into the SU-101, which is the one based on the T-44 chassis with the rear fighting compartment. It didn't work out. I can't remember why. I mean, SU-101 just failed entirely. The SU-122P, I think the gun was just too long and it kept clipping terrain. Maybe if you shorten it or something like that, or try to do this halfway solution. But the conclusion with the 100 millimeter gun was that it's fine for medium tanks, so medium chassis like the SU-100, and there's no point in developing a new gun just to keep out a new caliber. And they also tried to squeeze in the 100 millimeter gun into the T-44, which requires widening of the chassis, flattening of the turret, and then the T-44B became the T-54. Now the T-54 1945 is different than the T-54 we know and love today, but it was the first steps towards this vehicle. But yeah, there were definitely attempts to put a 122 millimeter gun into medium class platforms. They didn't work out so well.
Okay, so you have this 122 in there, and as I say, these are big shells, and you don't really have too many of them inside the IS. Was that considered a
28, I
problem?
believe. Um, it was a problem. They didn't like that. There were attempts to squeeze more ammo just anywhere that it would fit. But even at that point, you would get to like 30, 33 or 34 shells. Um, the thing is that IS-2 tanks they were specialists. They were called in for very specific breakthrough missions and later anti-tank missions as well. And the one big change um, with the deployment of heavy tanks was that when I said KVs were out front, they would soak up all the shells and get the enemy to reveal their anti-tank defenses. The IS-2s actually fought with a screen of medium tanks, so they were protected from all the sides and the front by medium tanks. The medium tanks, theoretically, the enemy anti-tank defenses would be scouted out by infantry. This didn't always happen. But there's a bigger, as the war goes on, there's a bigger and bigger focus on, hey, we can't just yeet tanks out there and have them try and do something on their own. That's never going to work. They still try to do it because you can't always organize cooperation with infantry and artillery. But there was a very big emphasis on IS-2s saying that, hey, this is not, a lone warrior standing on the field and enemies come at it from all sides and kill them all. This is a cog in the combined arms machine. The instructions that emphasize you don't have a lot of ammo, so use it wisely. And it was highlighted that, hey, these tanks need to go and resupply. They use more fuel than medium tanks. They have less ammo than medium tanks. They're the book is called Stalin's Warhammer. The IS-2, I would say, is more of a scalpel. It's you need to apply it correctly. It doesn't, you can't do everything with it. It's a narrow purpose tank that you need to use in a correct situation.
You could say the same about Tiger.
Absolutely correct. Yep.
So the Germans were very heavy into rail mobility. So you'd send a Tiger battalion somewhere, you'd expect it to go by train, and then if you had to go to another part of the front, ideally it would go by train. Was that was the IS designed to be a little bit more self-propelled going around from A to B, or did they just say, okay, that regiment is going there, it's going to stay there?
One of the biggest differences in terms of philosophy, I guess, was reliability. So the IS-2 has only a 520 horsepower engine. The KV had 600 horsepower. And one of the reasons was to make it more reliable. And there's always these battles to, make track lengths last longer, make suspension elements last longer. An IS-2 tank by 1944, I have exact figures on my blog. I'm not sure if they're in the book. It's expected to drive somewhere between 1,700 and 1,800 kilometers. So a typical offensive operation is 500 to 600. I mean, this is deep armored thrusts of summer of 1944. It's maybe 500 kilometers. Probably less. So an IS-2 tank can drive somewhere on its own power, run through 2 or 3 of these operations, and at that point you need to pull it out for an overhaul. So it wasn't as reliable as a T-34 or a Sherman. It was reliable enough. They never, as with the T-34, they never stopped trying to make it run for longer. But obviously, if you have a heavier tank, it's not going to last as long with 1940s technology.
So towards the end of the book, you start talking about the improvement of the armor, changing the shape of the front slope. Was that considered to be an interim change pending IS-3, or was it more we're going to have both side by side?
It was an interim change. It wasn't pending the IS-3. So let me show you for my for the viewers there. If I can untangle myself from the wires. So you can see that the KV-85, the shape of the front armor of the IS-2.
They're both a bit low.
So you can see the kind
hold
of...
the right one up a bit more. There you go.
Okay. You can see the kind of step up here with the driver's vision port. This part up here is obviously weaker than the one that's highly sloped. And then this guy here, it's all one slope. So this was 90 millimeters of armor, but it was all presented at a slope, whereas this was 120 millimeters of armor, but it was presented at a smaller slope. So this protected the hull from even the German Long 88 at 500 or 600 meters. I can't remember exactly. But the turret was still the same. So you still had your 120 millimeters rounded, and that was an issue. And so the hull protection was considered sufficient until the fall of 1944, when there was it was no longer considered sufficient. I think it was just priorities changed. It wasn't really any kind of new German developments they found out about. And so you had the IS-2U, which was a development of Kirov factory, and then you had the IS-2 development of factory number 100, and then you had the IS-2 Kirovitz 1, which is development of Kirov factory in Chelyabinsk. And so I don't. This is also on my blog somewhere. I can't take a turret off of this one. Anyway, here's the IS-3. This is a 1/30th scale model and not a 1/35th, so it's a little bit bigger. One of the tanks in question had the bowl-shaped turret, so Chelyabinsk factory developed the bowl-shaped turret, and then factory number 100 developed the pointy pike front with a very important feature: driver's hatch. On the IS-2, the driver has to go out through the turret. On the IS-3, he actually got his own hatch. And so these tanks were initially competitors, except the wise decision was made to merge them into one model. And so you had, very importantly, without an increase in weight, so an IS-3 weighs 46 tons, 45.5 to 46 tons, and IS-2 weighs 45 tons. Very small increase in weight, incredible increase in protection. So this front pike was almost completely impervious to even the Soviet 122 millimeter gun. It was completely impervious to the German 88. Even the sights here are sloped. There's trials results where the German Long 88 doesn't penetrate it at a range of like 300 meters. So exceptional armor for a 46 ton tank. None of these made it into battle in World War II. Someone asked in the chat, I think, if any of them were used in Manchuria. No, they weren't.
So people talk about heavy tanks were a waste. You couldn't build a heavy tank. Look at the King Tiger; it was a waste of effort. Yet the IS-2, I don't think anybody says the IS-2 was a wasted effort. How did the Soviets create a functional, useful heavy tank whilst the Germans were not really? I mean, there must have been a sacrifice somewhere.
Well, it was weight. Weight was a very big factor. Kind of like, there's a reason why I bring up the development of the KV-1 and the KV-1S. One thing that I probably should have done in the book, if I was going to cover in great detail development of Soviet heavy tanks, is super heavy tanks. So in March of 1941, they hear some rumors about German super heavy tanks, Panzer V, Panzer VI, Panzer VII, which vaguely line up with the VK 3001, VK 6501, and something else. But it was these prototypes, Germans are going to have these 100-ton tanks with 105 millimeter guns. We need something huge to counter that. And so you have development of the KV-3, KV-4, KV-5. The KV-3 got closest, so someone asked, before if they were going to produce the T-34M. They were definitely going to produce the KV-3. It was a 70-ton tank. They took a T220 and they loaded it down with extra weights to kind of simulate and test transmission elements, and this thing was just falling apart. They were still going to build it. I'm not sure if they were going to ever mass produce it because it was just so unreliable with the technology they had at the time. And the same people 3 years later would start working on the IS-2. And so I'm sure all of this was fresh in their minds as they said, "Hey, we can't build, a 60-ton tank. We can't build a 70-ton tank. I mean, we can, but it won't drive very far or very well." And these very strict, very harsh weight requirements, they were honored and they were quite up there, quite important. Not to everyone. So the IS-4, Object 701, entered development in December of 1943. It was designed to combat the Ferdinand of all tanks. And so they just took the IS-2, slapped a bunch more armor on it. It was more complicated than that. There were a lot of other design changes. And the IS-4, or what became the IS-4, there's actually a push to put it into production in late 1944. So instead of the IS-3. And Malyshev, the People's Commissar of Tank Production, pushed hand and fist, we can't put this into production, not during wartime. Put in the IS-3, it was cheaper, or lighter at least. And then the IS-4 replaced it in production only a year later. A year after the war ended, and well, it was living. He was right. He was completely right. This thing was, even without pressures of wartime, it wasn't as reliable as the IS-3. It arguably wasn't even as well protected as the IS-3. And all this led to, in 1949, a decree that said we will not make heavy tanks heavier than 50 tons. Cancel IS-4, cancel the IS-7. 50 tons is your new weight limit. That's why the IS-8, and then later Stalin died, so it was renamed T-10. 50 tons was the maximum limit. And the IS-8 looks a lot more like the IS-3 than it does the IS-4. So there was definitely a push to keep weight to reasonable limits during the war and even after the war.
Okay. Well, we'll be doing this about an hour, so bring it a little bit to a close. But I just want to make sure that people understand if they are going to go buy this book, and I'll put a link. I will put a link in the description as to where it's coming from, the Military History Group. So I'm looking. It's like the first 40 pages is still KVs. There's KV-85, KV-13. This is a developmental history of the IS-2. It doesn't include combat history, export data, or anything else like that. This is technical and development history. That's a fair statement?
Yes, correct. There was this whole project came out of Bernard and I talking about making a book on the combat history. And then the proposal was that while he's busy with other projects, I can write this. We could put it out. There's gonna be a sequel. I can't say we've already started working on it, and it's not gonna be my next book or the one after that, and it's not going to be my next book with the Military History Group. But there is going to be a full book based on both Soviet and German primary sources that is going to cover the combat history of the IS-2 tank.
Including export?
I don't know about including export, but we'll see.
So where did the 2 see export service?
China had them. Obviously the Warsaw Pact states had them. Can't remember if Austria ever got them. I know they got C-3485s. I think that might be it.
And there's no use, just to confirm, there's no use of IS-2s in Korea.
Not that I've seen. Not by the North Koreans, anyway. The Chinese army might have had them. I haven't looked into it. I know there's documents from the CIA that say the IS-3 has been spotted. It's a guy told me that someone else told him that, there was an IS-3 and it was big and green. So, checks out. Good information. No IS-3s were used in Korea. I can tell you that for certain.
All right. Right. Any last comments you want to throw out there?
Not really. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for promoting the book. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for asking interesting questions. I'm sure I haven't answered all of them.
Well, William has a question for you. Were the Russians afraid of Bob Semple?
Oh, they're terrified. Stalin had a picture of the Bob Semple, on the toilets, in front of the toilet, so to get the whole process going faster.
Fair enough. Okay, well, good chatting with you. Shame we didn't make it. We were originally going to do this, actually. We were both in Europe at the same time last couple of weeks ago, but unfortunately things didn't work out. But next time, maybe. We'll see. Right. In that case, I presume I'll see you up at a keynote if you're going to attend.
Yep, that's the plan.
All right. Well, okay. Well, now everybody knows what Tank Archives looks like. So you can keep a lookout for him at Tank Museum if you're out and about. I will return to the more normal pre-recorded stuff next release. So again, this is Pete Samsonov of Tank Archives. He's got the new IS-2 book over his left shoulder, but whatever. And I will put a link out. I'll edit the description of this video in very short order so you can have a look and see where you can get this. Could the 128mm go through IS-3? Somebody asked twice.
The 128? I don't think they ever tested it.
Okay, there we go. All right. Have fun, lads. Take care.
Bye, everyone.